Founding a Nation, 1783 to 1789, Chapter 7. During what we call the Revolutionary Era, which is the decades just immediately after the Revolution, most Americans were thinking of their nation as a rising empire, and we're going to eventually control all of North America. Grandiose dreams. And we would have this empire. It wasn't going to be ruled by force like the empires in Europe. Thomas Jefferson even wrote, and I'm quoting, "America would be an empire of liberty, cemented by a commitment to the principles of the Declaration of Independence," unquote. Well, no matter how you looked at it, we were already bigger than Great Britain, Spain, and France put together. And we were benefiting considerably from our isolation from all the wars and stuff going on in Europe. We had a very young population and very broad distribution of property, and most of the whites were pretty literate. Yet, we had some of the same problems that Great Britain had after the war of French and Indian War. Had a lot of land, but you really didn't have control of all that western land, west of the mountains. And even though we'd like to think that it was empty, it was populated by Indians. It was bordered on the north by the British and on the south and the west by the Spanish. They did pose a possible military threat, and they very definitely posed a commercial threat. And when you get right down to it, we had very few big cities. Most of our population was rural. And the people were of different ethnic backgrounds for this time and different religious groups. And no republic had ever been established in such a large area with such a large group of diverse people. So even though we had won the war, are we going to be able to maintain the peace, and is the unity of our nation going to be assured? Well, looks like we might come together if we're not careful. We had a Constitution. It's called the Articles of Confederation. And although it had been drafted immediately after the Declaration by the Congress in 1777, it wasn't approved by all the states until 1781, toward the end of the war. I mean, we had a war to fight. They didn't have time to get together and vote. Now, this Articles of Confederation was basically an attempt to balance the national coordination with the need to win the war, and balance that against, well, the fears the people had against a centralized power, because that would threaten their liberty, they thought. And with the Articles, the 13 states retained their own sovereignty. In other words, all power belonged to the states. We had no president to enforce the laws. There was no judiciary to interpret the laws. And any major decisions required the approval of 9 states rather than a simple majority. Yes, the national government had the power to regulate the war. It even had the power to declare war and conduct foreign relations. But that was it. Congress could make money, and I don't mean print it, I mean have a business where they had profits. But they could not impose taxes. That's the key. They could not impose taxes. They couldn't regulate commerce. And any money it actually had, because it wasn't making any money, was voluntary contributions from the state governments. And that's a joke. Voluntary contributions? Yeah. And although the amendments could be made to the Articles, there was never any enough votes gotten together to pass anything. The Articles made a strong central government impossible, but they did enable the states to surrender any disputed claims to western lands and give them to the federal government, which was a major achievement. Now, at this point in time, we had, like Georgia and Carolina and Virginia predominantly were claiming all the lands west, and Virginia was claiming practically everything that wasn't claimed by anybody else. So we managed to persuade them to make a grant to the federal government, so that in theory the federal government was going to sell the land and make money to finance them. And the only thing that I think there's got a map coming up here pretty soon and shows you what all they gave. But Congress did try to set rules for settling the enormous new national domain. Like I said, we Americans considered it empty, although we knew, or should have known, or recognized the fact that there were over 100,000 Indians out there, plus a lot of Mexicans. But Congress felt that when they declared their independence from Britain, that Indians had forfeited any right they had to the land when they sided with the British, despite the fact that only a couple of tribes did that. So the government went about securing land from the Indians and north of the Ohio River, and In the South, they left small parts of the lands there to be held permanently by the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw tribes, which are going to cause a problem when Andrew Jackson becomes president. And though many national leaders believed that the nation's prosperity depended upon the farmers gaining Western lands, others saw all this government land sales as a source of revenue. And some even worried that, this is going to cause a perennial conflict with the Indians. And of course, the private land companies hoped to buy up all the land they could and sell it to settlers at a huge profit. So the war's end caused a large number of Americans to start migrating westward because we had itchy feet from the day we hit the East Coast. Never content to stay where we were, always moving west. They wanted to move west into upstate New York and what would become Kentucky and Tennessee. They actually believed that it was their right to take the western lands. It was essential for American freedom. They ignored Indian land titles and demanded the government sell or give away the land. And they often settled into land where they had no legal title. And some of our national leaders are starting to get worried that these ambitious settlers were a little bit unruly and disorderly and did not care if they're going to incite Indian wars. So they began to try to figure out a way to regulate Western settlement. Now here's what I'm talking about. These are the 13 original colonies that became 13 states. And as you can see, Virginia is claiming all of this. Now, this little area in here, North Carolina ceded, but actually Virginia never did recognize North Carolina's claim to it. She claimed it. Tennessee, Kentucky, and everything north, which is going to later become 5 different states. Virginia even claimed up in here. Massachusetts is claiming some. Connecticut is claiming some. They're called the landed states. And little states like Delaware and Rhode Island and Connecticut, they didn't like the idea because they had nothing to claim. But Virginia is claiming it all regardless of what anybody else says. She said, it's mine. And she eventually gave everything except what's now Kentucky to the federal government. Well, one of the ways they went about settling it was to set up a series of ordinances. And the first one was in 1784, written by Thomas Jefferson. And he was trying to establish the steps by which the area could become governed. And the idea was to divide the regions into districts. Congress is going to govern them. And once they met all the agreements and all the rules to become a state, they would be allowed to come in as a state. Congress rejected by a single vote a clause in that bill that would have prohibited slavery in the entire area. In 1785, next year, an ordinance was written regulating land sales in the region north of the Ohio River. And the whole area from west of the Mississippi, north of the Ohio, became known as the Northwest Territory. The land was to be surveyed by the government and sold in sections for $1 per acre, but the sections were large. And it was trying to control and concentrate settlements and to raise money for the Congress. But the settlers violated the rules by moving to areas where surveys had not been done. They'd like the land better over there. The grass is always greener on the other side. Now, initially, the minimum purchase required by the government was way too big for the individual farmer to pay. You've got to realize that during this time, if you had $500 a year, you had big money. So even at $1 an acre, that was stretching it for the farmer because he didn't have any cash. I mean, the war's just over. Everybody's strapped for cash. And the government wanted the coin of the realm. They didn't want to barter. So the land wound up being sold to large land companies and speculators, who then divided the land into smaller sections that the Western mover could possibly afford. And of course, even though they were charging less than the government was, they were making large profits. This is going to cause a lot of Americans to start demanding that the government provide cheap or even free land to her citizens. And the next year, in 1787, another ordinance was passed, and this is the one I want you to remember, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It called for the establishment of 3 to 5 states in that whole area. Excuse me. And this was going to ensure Jefferson's empire of liberty, because he envisioned everybody getting 50 or 100 acres. And the U.S., again, is not going to rule it, but allow the land to become part of a political system as self-governing states. Now, that's a very key fact. It also recognized the Indians' claim, and it promised to never, never take the land as long as the sun shines, as long as the rivers flow, until the white man wants it. Forgive my cynicism. The ordinance, and this is the part you need to remember, that ordinance of 1787, called Northwest Ordinance, prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. What they have done, in effect, is put a fence around the slavery in the South. There's so much other land down there in the Southwest that the South isn't concerned right now, but this is eventually going to cause a lot of problems. That no slavery north of the Ohio River, basically. As you can see, this is just showing you different areas. This is the entire Northwest Territory, and Virginia was claiming most of this. Like I said, all she kept was Kentucky. And Kentucky, she actually released to become a state in 1792, after Vermont became a state. Now, most, or I wouldn't say most, I'll say most of the upper class, most of the leaders of the Revolution, prominent Americans, they thought that these Articles of Confederation were flawed or weak. And actually, there'd been a financial crisis in the 1780s. I mean, and if, when you get right down to it, to finance the war, Congress had borrowed large sums of money. They sold interest-bearing bonds, and they paid soldiers and suppliers in notes to be redeemed at a later date. I'll gladly repay you next Tuesday type thing. But without any money coming in, Congress couldn't even pay the interest on the debts. And the British pulled a sneaky, and they did not reestablish trade as they had promised. They began to bar American ships from even trading in the West Indies. And they began to flood the American market with cheap goods, running a lot of the businesses, the small businesses just getting started out, because it's like when Walmart comes into an area. They promise they're going to be careful and do this and do that, sell things cheap, but you've got to realize that when you buy in bulk, you can sell things cheaper. And an example is my sister had her own business in Illinois. And so I'd go up and visit her every week. And, well, I didn't live here then. I lived in Kentucky at that time. And it was just a 2-hour journey from where I lived to where she lived. And I would be sometimes mention the fact that I had made a good purchase at the local Kroger store. I had managed to get like 6 or 7 12-packs of Pepsis for $8 or $10. I'm a Pepsi-holic. And she'd go, what? You're buying Pepsi-Cola cheaper retail than she could buy at wholesale, because the store I was buying from was a large chain and could buy in bulk and sell it to me cheaper than she could buy it, because you only buy it, you only have room for so much in a small business. And that's what Wally World would do. She'd come in and she'd reduce the price to where she'd actually sometimes lose money on goods, but you couldn't afford to sell it that cheap. And this is what England was doing. She was pouring all this English goods in here, actually below the level to make them, to put us out of business, to make us sorry for what we had done. Well, the states decided they didn't like this. So the states began to print their own money, and they passed laws postponing debt collections. Well, the people who had money owed to them, they saw these laws as infringements on their property rights, which they very definitely were. In the late 1786 and early 1787, our army was made up of farmers. And if the farmers all fighting a war, there's no money being made on the crops because there's no crops planted or harvested. And so he can't pay his taxes. Well, Massachusetts decided that they needed money, and they started seizing the lands for failure to pay their taxes, instead of coming up with a bill to either lower the taxes or say, okay, we'll give you time to pay them, or we're going to forgive them and just start paying taxes now. They wanted it now, and if you couldn't pay now, they repossessed the land. Well, a man named Daniel Shays led what came to be known as a rebellion, Shays Rebellion, and he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And this group of farmers who'd had their land repossessed by the banks, they wanted relief from the debt, and they wanted the government to print more money, which is always the cry of the public whenever there's an economic crisis. Have the government print more money, like that's going to help anything. And they thought that they were actually just continuing the revolutionaries' tradition. Well, it didn't take long till the government of Massachusetts got up his own militia and put the rebellion down. Well, this little revolt kind of waved red flags, so to speak, and some very influential American businessmen said, we need a stronger national government. We need one that's going to encourage economic growth, and one that's going to protect property and secure law and order, and eliminate this business of what Massachusetts is doing. You know, make them a strong national government. Give it more power. Meanwhile, James Madison, I have a disciple of Jefferson. That's putting it very mildly. He was afraid of democratic excesses. And he was one of the leaders of what we call a move to strengthen the national government. They became known as nationalists. He had a very strange bed partner called Alexander Hamilton in New York, who we'll learn much more about a little bit later. different sides of the political spectrum, but they both realized we need a strong central government. And Alexander Hamilton, he was an advocate of a very robust and powerful government. He wanted us to be the nation that rules the world military, commercial world power. Uh, they also found allies among others. A lot of people had their consciousness raised on this new republicanism and democracy thing. Then there were the people like the army officers and members of Congress, and they hadn't been paid. Diplomats and people who were holding those bonds that we sold, they'd like to be paid. Artisans wanted some tariff protection. So you got some support from all different places, all demanding a stronger national government. Meanwhile, a group of, I guess you'd say, businessmen, farmers, big farmers, and people who own plants and things. It'd be like South Carolina and North Carolina not getting along. And anytime anybody from North Carolina came into South Carolina, we'd charge them this huge tariff. And South Carolina had her Navy, and North Carolina had an army, and we're fighting back and forth, and there's nobody to stop us because we're an independent little individual state, We need someone to tell us to behave or go sit in the corner for time out. And in this type of environment, you can't have trade. If you haven't got trade, you haven't got any money coming in. If you have, that's the whole thing. We need to trade and make money. So they decided to get together, and they asked all the states to get together, but only 6 of them showed up at Annapolis, Maryland. They were looking at ways to regulate their commerce and foreign commerce and interstate travel. And they managed to come up with some agreements where maybe North Carolina and South Carolina can get along and not have any problems, and we could even go into Georgia and nobody had any problem. We'd trade back and forth and everybody make money and everybody be happy. Because we're actually an advocate of what we call the trickle-down effect in economics. As near as I can explain, okay, I own a business in South Carolina. I own a boat building business. And I buy material from my local distributors to build it. They make money. I hire local people to build the boats. They make money, and I pay them because I'm making money off of them. And they go out and they spend their money. Well, the economy is stimulated by more money coming into the economy. But now, if nobody's buying my boats, first thing I'm going to do is stop buying material to build boats, and the next thing I'm going to do is start laying people off. So then my boat supplier doesn't get any money. My employees aren't getting any money. We're dead in the water. But if I'm successful and a lot of people are buying my boats, the theory is I'm going to be making so much money that the distributor I'm buying from is going to be making more money. I'm going to hire more employees to build more boats, and the more employees I have, the more money they're going to spend, so I'm stimulating the economy. So my success as a business owner is strengthening the economy and causing it to move. So it's very important for the government to have me be successful. Get the picture? This is where the government is starting to sway toward supporting the businessman with a trickle-down effect. If the business is successful, it's going to trickle down into the economy. Well, this is pretty much what these guys decided. We got to, when you've got rebellions going on around you, nobody's working and nobody's spending any money. So they decided, well, since we got together and everything did so well, why don't we get all the states to get together and see if we can do something to amend this Articles of Confederation? So they sent out a request, and 55 men came to Philadelphia and met in a place called Constitutional Hall to amend the Constitution. Now there was George Washington, John Adams, Ben Franklin. John Hancock wasn't there. Sam Adams wasn't there. Patrick Henry wasn't there. He thought the whole thing was a sneaky way to try to take power away from the states. All these men that were there, and they were men, white men, they were well-fed, well-bred, and the whole bit. They were men of wealth, they were educated, they were all white, all high social status, and most of them owned slaves. They were not exactly what we call representatives of the common man. And they all believed that democracy had gone too far. When you put too much democracy in the hands of the unpropertied man, the uneducated man, you have problems, they believed. But they all shared a commitment that a stronger national government had to be made. They deliberated in private to ensure free and honest debate, they said, but actually they didn't want the common man to hear what was going on. And records of the proceedings were not to be published until 1840, when all the delegates had already died. Now, they did come up with some agreements. There would be a new legislature, there'd be an executive and a judiciary, and a new national government. And actually, they're not amending, they're rewriting. And this new Constitution is going to allow the Congress to raise money through direct taxes without relying on the state governments for revenue. This is great. This is great. And the federal government would represent the people. And even delegates who thought democracy had gone too far rejected Alexander Hamilton's proposal for a king and a House of Lords. Yeah, he's a dude. Now, I have this picture for several reasons. I want you to look at how these people are dressed. The room is closed. The windows are closed. It's warm. These men, a lot of them have wigs on. They've got stockings and tight pants and long coats and long sleeve shirts and the whole bit. You know they had to be sweating like a racehorse. And there had to be quite a perspiration odor in that room. But debates centered on how to balance federal and state governments. The interest of the small states like Rhode Island and large states like New York. Madison proposed something called the Virginia Plan, which proposed the creation of a two-house legislature with the state's population determining its representation in each house. Smaller states who feared domination by the more populous states began to counter with the New Jersey Plan, calling for a single-house Congress in which each state had one vote. They came up with a compromise and agreed to come with a two-house Congress with a Senate in which each state had 2 members. In other words, whether you were Rhode Island or whether you were New York, no matter how many people you had, you just had 2 representatives. You would have a House of Representatives that would be elected by the populace and based on your population of the state. Senators were going to be elected for a 6-year term, and representatives were to be elected every 2 years directly by the people. The senators are not elected by the people. That's a very useful painting of James Madison, called the father of the Constitution, because he's the one that came up with the Virginia Plan. The direct election of the members of the House of Representatives was supposed to be an expansion of democracy because of the white male suffrage. But the government structure created by this Constitution represented overall a limitation on democracy, because delegates hoped to isolate the nation's government from popular sentiments that would have alarmed the elite in the 1780s. They wanted to ensure that the right men were elected to the office. So the people are going to be the sovereigns, but they're going to be chosen from the elite. While people would remain sovereign, as I said, they would choose those who govern them from among the elite. They assumed that the Senate would be comprised of each state's most prominent citizens, because they're going to be appointed by the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, though small, assumed the only very prominent men would win election in large districts. Well, yes and no. Because if you're a common man working out in the boonies, you're busy felling trees and killing Indians and trying to plow the land and make a living. You haven't got time to go to the big cities and sit in a room and talk about things. So you go to your neighbor who has slaves to do his work. He has time. So without even realizing it, we were actually encouraging this. Either the president or the federal judge would be elected directly by the people. The president was to be chosen by something called the Electoral College, or the House, and electors were not voted on directly by you and me. The Electoral College was an indirect means to elect the president, because the delegates, they didn't trust the ordinary voters to choose the president and vice president directly, and number one, they probably didn't even know who they would be voting for. They didn't actually have CNN back in those days. The Constitution itself is really quite brief, and it barely outlines the structure of the national government. But it embodies 2 very basic political principles. Federalism, sometimes called the division of powers, and a system of something called checks and balances between the different branches of government, also called the separation of powers. So federalism means a division. Checks and balances means that each of you are going to check on the other one. Now, federalism is the relation between the national government and the states, really. And the Constitution, compared to the Articles, strengthened national authority, and it gave the president power to enforce the law and command the military. It gave Congress powers to impose taxes, to borrow money, to regulate commerce, to declare war, to deal with the Indians and foreign nations, and promote the general welfare. States were barred from printing their own money or relieving debtors. They could no longer do that. They could do that under the Articles, but they couldn't do it under this new Constitution. But the daily responsibilities of government, such as law enforcement and education, these were to be left up to the individual states. Excuse me. Oh. What would we do without our coffee? The separation of powers is the way that Congress is designed to prevent any single branch of the national government from dominating the other two branches, which is hard to do because the House of Representatives seems to think that they should be the ones who lead the way. This has been a fight since the 1780s. The House of Representatives thinks, we're directly elected by the people. We should be the ones in power. Congress enacts laws, but the president can veto them. Within a 2/3 majority can overturn his veto. Federal judges are nominated by the president, and still are, and approved by Congress. But they have lifelong terms to ensure their independence. The president can be impeached by the House and then removed from office by the Senate. Now, slavery sparked debate at the Constitutional Convention, although the words slavery or slave do not appear in the Constitution. The Constitution affected slavery as accepted it almost as an institution. It prohibits Congress from banning the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years. It requires states to return fugitive slaves to their owners. And it stipulates that 3/5 of a slave could be counted for representation. This was something, since we had to have approval by majority of the states, South Carolina said she wouldn't go along with this. And of course, if South Carolina didn't go along, North Carolina didn't go along, Georgia didn't go along, Virginia didn't go along, so you lost your majority. She said, and it was right at the time, the large cities in the North had a larger population for counting for representation. Whereas in the South, we had large plantations, but we had a very small white population as compared to the North. So she figured she should be able to count a slave for representative purposes, even though they couldn't vote and weren't considered citizens. Well, they finally reached a compromise. It's called a 3/5 compromise, where a slave could be counted as 3/5 of a person for representation. And Carolina was happy. The slaves, they compromises over slavery. It seems like slavery is becoming very important in politics to our country. And the Constitution allowed for the importation of slaves to continue until 1808 at the Census of South Carolina. And in 1808, it was finally prohibited. Now, that's not the selling of slaves, that's the importation of slaves. But by then, an additional 170,000 more slaves had been brought to the United States. More than 1/4 of all the slaves carried to the country since 1700. And this fugitive slave cause gave slavery, shall we say, extraordinary powers. So slavery as a legal condition remained the status of an individual slave, even if that individual slave entered a free state where slavery was abolished, which we get into in the 1850s. The Constitution did not give the national government power to interfere with slavery or make slavery illegal. In other words, the federal government couldn't come along and outlaw slavery. The states weren't going to stand for that. And of course, this 3/5 clause gave the white South the dominance in the House of Representatives. And every president had, the first 4 presidents elected between 1788 and 1848 was a Southern slaveholder. And even after that. Once the delegates approved the document, it was sent to the states to be ratified. And the Constitution established a new framework for American development. It enabled a national market to develop by giving Congress power over tariffs, interstate commerce, and the power to print money, power to grant patents, bankruptcy rules, and prohibiting interference with private property. And even though the Constitution provided that they would go into effect when 9 states had approved, not all 13 states As in the Articles of Confederation required, ratification was not certain. Each state held an election for delegates to a special statewide ratifying convention, and these elections generated a lot of activity. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay got together and authored a series of 85 essays that they called The Federalist in 1788. And they argued that the Constitution did not endanger but protected American liberties. Madison, especially in essays number 10 and 51, developed a new vision of the relationship between government and the society of the U.S. He identified the basic dilemma of the new republic. Government must be based on the will of the people, but the people were susceptible to dangerous opinions, especially those that might threaten property rights. And Madison was worried that a growing number of poor in the future might use their political power to secure a more equal distribution of wealth. The solution for Madison was to be found in the republic's size and diversity. We need to expand the sphere. Previous republics had always been small in size, but the size of our country, he argued, would stabilize, not weaken, its governments. In a nation so large, with so many distinct interests, we would develop that no single interest would ever be able to take over the government and dominate the others. Naivete, right? Every majority would be a coalition of minorities, and they secured their right. They would secure the rights of the individuals. He reassured the Americans that they had only to extend the sphere to ensure that the republic's perpetuation under the Constitution. He thus, I guess you'd say, strengthened the idea that westward expansion was essential to American freedom. Made the structure of government and its size, not the virtue, the basis of republicanism, and advanced the liberal notion that men are motivated by self-interest and that social good emerges from conflict between private interests. Those that opposed the ratification I think I have skipped something here. Let me go back just a minute. Okay. No, I didn't. Those that opposed the ratification, they said it favored the powerful, the elite of the country more than their liberty. But the anti-federalists are really poorly organized, and they had the belief that the new government would be controlled by those hostile to the ordinary American. In other words, the upper class, the elites. They're not going to want to have anything to do with the lower class. And they believed that a small republic could succeed, but they kept using the word liberty. Liberty is the watchword. And they charged that the Constitution did not protect individual rights. But the pro-Constitution politics prevailed, especially in the large cities. They were men of wealth. But the promise of prosperity appealed to others, even though if I'm not rich, I see the person who's leading this group is rich, and they, the promise that it's there, I can possibly get it. It appealed to the urban artisans, the laborers and sailors who thought a stronger central government would revive a lagging economy because it's going downhill. We're having a depression. The anti-federalists found most of its support in the rural and frontier areas populated by struggling farmers who wanted nothing to do with government. Ultimately, the pro-constitutionalist energy in their organization and command of the press, because they commanded most of their newspapers, they prevailed. And Madison won support for the Constitution by promising that the first Congress elected, the first order of business was going to be to enact a Bill of Rights. And although many people in Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia opposed the document, actually only Rhode Island and North Carolina really voted against the ratification. The individual rights that are protected by the Constitution and celebrated by Americans were not actually in the original document ratified in 1788. Like I say, Madison had promised that Congress would pass a Bill of Rights in order to gain support for ratification. But he really believed that such a bill was redundant, it's not needed. and it would not prevent majorities from violating constitutional rights in the future. But each new state constitution had a Bill of Rights. He's called the father of the Bill of Rights, and originally there was 19 proposals, of which 10 passed. The Constitution now recognizes religious freedom, but it does not refer to God, and it bars religious tests for office holders. Now, this is the 10 that were ratified. The First Amendment, it prohibits Congress from legislating about religion and protecting freedom of the press and assembly. Freedom of the press, assembly, and religion. That's a lot in one little amendment. The second one, the right to bear arms and organize militias. Of course, that has to do with protection because we didn't have a standing army at the time. No quartering of military in peacetime. This is what we got into trouble with England about. Remember, all those redcoats being forced to be quartered in private homes. No unreasonable search and seizure. Well, this takes care of that blanket search warrant that the English used to have. And even now, when you have a search warrant issued, you have to state what it is you're looking for. You cannot be forced to testify against yourself. You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Now, this one is the one that has been mangled so badly. All you have to do nowadays is call a grand jury, and if you don't answer the questions of the prosecutor, you can be put in jail for contempt of court. You're testifying against yourself. Right to a speedy trial, which is a joke. Sometimes you've been in jail nowadays for 2 or 3 years before you go to trial because the trial docket is so backed up. But this was there. And the 7th deals with lawsuits against the state. The 8th, no cruel and unusual punishment. This is the one they always go to when they talk about the death punishments. 9 is rights retained by the people. Those not specifically mentioned in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights were retained by the people, which opens the door basically for new rights not talked about in the text. The 10th Amendment affirmed that powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states were reserved for the states, and actually protecting states against encroaching federal power. Now here you just have a map of those that were for and those were against. This over here is the politically unorganized. They're not even really territories yet. The pink's pretty evenly divided. But the federal, the blue, Federalist majority for ratification, but as you can see, it covers the big cities where the population is. That's how a minority can gain control sometimes. The Bill of Rights showed how the Revolution changed it. But most remarkably, the Constitution recognized religious freedom. Now, where did my religious thing go to? I need to make better notes, I guess. The Constitution begins with "we the people," but this people does not include all living people in the United States. It does not include the Indians. It does not include other persons or the slaves, because we didn't say slaves. It's other persons in the Constitution. The people. In other words, the people are white. Indians, the Indians are thought by most Americans to be unfit for citizenship. They were not represented in the new government. And the treaty system we had with them gave them a unique status of independence, which we have a lot of these casinos run by Indians, which are not taxed. They were treated as a sovereign nation, but the treaties, usually signed by only a few, especially in an unrepresentative member of a tribe, they were not represented, and they were essentially a means of transferring Indian land to the states or federal governments. Most people thought that the Indians were totally unfit for citizenship. They needed to be removed. They needed to just plain disappear or be assembled in. Bad situation. Military conflicts between the Indians and the whites continued to 1794 when the Treaty of Grenville was signed, which gave Ohio and Indiana the United States, and the tribes received annual grants of money. as long as the water flows, as long as the sun shines, these treaties that we signed with the Indians. But like I said, unfortunately, they're only as good as long as the United States military would enforce them, and the Indians weren't sitting on land that the white man wanted. John Locke argued that liberty flowed from man having the power of reason, and it seems a contradiction to deny liberty to people based on the color of their skin. Thomas Jefferson believed Indians were not inferior, they were just at a less advanced stage of civilization. The same argument we're going to be using a little bit later on when we go in to take over countries and we become a colonial power. Thomas Jefferson wrote in something called the Notes on the State of Virginia, he claimed that African Americans, because of their nature, I just signed the Treaty of Grenville to show you the different tribes that are around. Choctaw, Upper Creek, Lower Creeks. My husband was a half Cherokee Indian. He's from Kansas. Blacks, because of their nature and experience of slavery, were disloyal to America. Why would they be disloyal to someone who kept them in bondage? I don't understand that at all. He also speculated that the blacks were inherently inferior to whites. And while he believed that Indians might have the capability to become civilized, he did not believe blacks naturally had this capacity. And while hoping for the end of slavery and opposing the slave trade, he also supported colonization, or the idea that once the black was a free man, freed from slavery, he could never fully become part of the American way, so he should be colonized in America or some other island. And in his ambivalent approach to race and slavery, Jefferson actually reflected the thinking of a lot of his generation. The Constitution does not define who are citizens. The states define the boundaries of freedom. In some few states, free blacks actually had some rights for a while, but the vast majority of blacks were enslaved and not considered eligible for citizenship even if they became free. In early immigration policy, they excluded blacks. Why would they want to let them come in on their own? We're bringing them in by the boatload. And then they passed a Naturalization Act in 1790 that defined those that could enter as free white persons. John Locke argued that liberty flowed from one man having the power of reason. And it seemed to contradict at the time. Why would we deny liberty to rational beings? It just didn't make any sense. White Americans saw blacks as lacking self-control, reason, and allegiance to the community. This is just a chart showing the population. Total population under 41,000, slaves 158, free blacks 630 in New Hampshire in 1790. Even found Carolina. South Carolina had 149,000 plus, 107,000 slaves, 1,800 free blacks. The Revolution had actually widened the divide between free Americans and enslaved Americans. And with the decline of apprenticeship and indentured servitude, expanded freedom for whites caused this divide. Race now becomes a convenient justification for slavery in a nation dedicated to liberty, where we the people means white Americans. Well, you didn't even get by without having a YouTube of John Green, did you? What he's going to do is just reiterate pretty much what I've said. I think it's, 12 minutes long. I love the way he puts things. Come on.
Learn everything from supply and demand. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Stan? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other country stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Stan. No, Stan, not the libertage. Cue the intro. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. All right, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In 2 words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Ah, supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments, taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation: Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course World History fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must. And the Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through treaties signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs, but because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, in fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, I mean, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Yes, I know, you have fantastic elections in Canada. Yeah, right, okay, all that too. I get it. Okay, it's U.S. history, Thought Bubble. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a two-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. New Jersey. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us two houses. A House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though of course they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious 3/5 compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons, the word slave was never used, would be the basis for the calculation. So, yeah, that's still in the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a fugitive slave clause requiring any escaped slave to be returned to their master. And this meant that a slave couldn't escape slavery by moving to a state where slavery was outlawed, which meant that on some level, some states couldn't enforce their own laws. Spoiler alert, this becomes problematic. But except for the tyranny of slavery, the framers really hated tyranny. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced 2 principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise. You can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state government. As an American, I am a citizen both of the United States and of the state of Indiana. And the national government, the one set up by the Constitution, is supposed to be limited in scope to certain enumerated powers. Most other powers, especially the protection of health, safety, and morals, are left to the states. But the Constitution also seeks to protect against the radicalism that too much democracy can bring. The mostly rich framers worried that the people, many of whom were poor and indebted, might vote in congresspeople or, God forbid, a president in favor of, redistribution of property. To hedge against this, senators were elected by the states, usually by state legislatures, and they were supposed to be leading citizen types. You know, the kind of good Americans who take bribes and have adulterous affairs in airport bathrooms and patronize prostitutes and shoot Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, the other hedge against too much democracy is the aforementioned Electoral College, which many Americans hate because it has the potential to elect a president who did not win the popular vote. But that's kind of the point. The electors were supposed to be prominent, educated men of property who were better able to elect a president than, the rabble. But the Constitution of the United States is a really impressive document document, especially when you consider its longevity. I mean, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, the nation-state is pretty new on the historical scene, and the United States established by the Constitution is actually one of the oldest ones. But the Constitution would be meaningless if it hadn't been ratified, which it was, but not without a fight that helped clarify America's political ideology. 9 out of the 13 states were required to ratify the Constitution, and special conventions called for the purpose. In order to convince the delegates to vote for it, 3 of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays that together are known as the Federalist Papers. Taken together, they're a powerful and ultimately persuasive argument for why a strong national government is necessary and ultimately not a threat to people's liberty. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I name the author of the mystery document, shock as in surprise. If I don't, shock as in Alright, Stan, let's see what we got here. If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it, if it should exist. Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton. Yes! Too easy, Stan, although I appreciate the opportunity for a rant. The whole idea of the Second Amendment was that the people could protect themselves from a standing army by being equally well armed, which these days would mean not that citizens should have the right to buy assault rifles, but that they should have the right to buy, like, unmanned drones, and arguably suitcase nukes. And by the way, in the Constitution, this is not listed as a privilege, it is listed as a right. And as a right, if I can't afford my own Predator drone, I guess the government should buy one for me. It's almost as if Alexander Hamilton had no way of knowing that weaponry would one day advance past the musket. P.S. You know how Alexander Hamilton died? Gunshot! Sorry, I had to. I am on a roll. So it would be easy to ignore the people who opposed the Constitution because, you know, they lost. But some of the ideas of these so-called anti-federalists were particularly powerful, and they deserve a bit of attention. Anti-federalists, unlike the mostly wealthy federalists, were usually supported by common people, small farmers who weren't as involved in commercial activity. They saw less need for a strong national government that would foster trade and protect creditors, and the anti-federalists were very afraid of a strong government, especially one dominated by the wealthy. Writers like James Winthrop held that a large group of United States would be like an empire, and that no extensive empire can be governed upon republican principles. As evidence, he could point to Britain, or all the way back to Rome. Smaller, more local governments are more responsive to the people and better able to protect their rights. To the anti-federalists, that meant state government. And while ultimately the Federalists won out and the Constitution was ratified, the issue of how large government should be did not go away. So the Constitution was really only a starting point. It's a vague document, and the details would be worked out in the political process, and then on the battlefield. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, and myself, edited by Stan and Mark Olson. The associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thoughtful. If you have questions about today's video or anything about American history, good news.
Just a couple of reminders. I failed to make a list, but I'm going to give it to you. Some hints. To me, this is one of the most important chapters of the entire book. How we came about getting the Constitution. One of the questions I would be willing to bet money, marbles, and chalk will show up on the test is, what did the founders mean by too much democracy? What was a great compromise? And by the way, that picture of Madison that Mr. Green showed was a much better picture than the one I showed you. You know, we had the fugitive slave law in there, but it was not really enforced in the 1850s when was one of the precursors of the Civil War. If you have not read the text, if you've just skimmed it, be sure you read that section toward the end of the chapter called Jefferson, Slavery, and Race. It's a rather eye-opening piece of information. He wrote a lot of it in his notes on the state of Virginia, published in 1785. It kind of goes to explain what's going to come up when he becomes president. Like I say, I wished I could have spent more time on this, but after last week's really long lecture, I'm trying to keep it a little bit short this time. If you haven't read the Chapter 7, at least skim it. And like I said, Mr. Green tells you pretty much everything I told you, but in a different format. So until next time.